The corridors of the palace were silent, yet heavy with the weight of centuries. Every polished surface reflected a legacy of power, tradition, and expectation. Golden chandeliers hung like frozen stars, illuminating the faces of portraits that had watched generations pass. Stoic, unmoving, judgmental. Outside, the world moved in a rush, unaware of the choreography that kept royalty untouchable. Inside, the smallest misstep could unravel centuries of order. Princess moved through this labyrinth with grace that came not from instruction, but from instinct. Her posture was perfect, her steps measured, yet there was a softness in her gaze that no protocol could teach. Today, however, there was a tension in the air that she could not ignore. A shadow, slight but present, seemed to brush past the edges of her awareness. The guards, ever vigilant, lined the hallways, statuesque and disciplined. Their eyes scanned each visitor, each aide, each whisper of movement. But one guard, an unassuming figure whose name few outside the palace ever knew, sensed something different. It wasn't just the footfalls echoing in the marble hall. It was a flicker of unease, a momentary crack in the armor of routine. And paused, a moment of hesitation that seemed almost insignificant in the grand theater of royal life. Yet, in that pause, danger found its way closer. Not the kind of danger that screams and shatters, but the quiet, creeping sort that waits for the perfect moment to disrupt, to test, to break. The guard moved subtly, almost invisibly, adjusting his position, a silent dance of awareness. Every rule he had sworn to uphold whispered in his mind, reminding him, protocol exists for a reason. No deviation, no improvisation, no surprises. Yet instinct, honed by years of service and a deep respect for the princess he protected, demanded action, and turned her head slightly, catching the faintest motion in the corner of her eye. Her heart skipped, not in panic, but in the acute awareness of something amiss. The palace, with all its grandeur and history, had never felt smaller, more constricting, more dangerous. It was then that the guard acted, not with force, not with noise, but with a presence so deliberate that it altered the course of the moment without anyone else realizing. He shifted a step, a breath, a subtle barrier between, and in what she did not yet see. The world continued as if nothing had changed, but for Anne, a chill ran down her spine. Something had been averted, something almost catastrophic. She met his eyes briefly. A fleeting connection, a whisper of understanding passed between them. No words were exchanged, but in that silent acknowledgement, a story unfolded, one that would leave her shaken, profoundly moved, and unexpectedly grateful. In the heart of tradition, where every movement is scripted, where every action is recorded in the invisible ledger of royal history, courage often hides in the shadows. And sometimes it does not roar. Sometimes it whispers. And resumed her walk, the echo of her shoes a metronome against the marble. But the memory of that whisper lingered, a secret act of bravery, unnoticed by the world, yet felt in the core of her being. She did not yet know what had been prevented or the weight of the guard's decision, but she knew instinctively that the walls of the palace had, in that moment, shielded her not just with stone and gold, but with something far more human, loyalty, courage, and quiet sacrifice. The day continued, outwardly ordinary, but for N, nothing would ever feel ordinary again. The invisible thread of protection, the presence of unseen courage, had made all the difference. And somewhere in the quiet corners of the palace, the guard remained vigilant, bound by duty yet guided by humanity that no protocol could contain. His actions, unrecorded, unnoticed by history, had carved a moment that, and would never forget, a moment where tradition bowed to instinct and protocol gave way to heart. The palace breathed in rhythm with centuries-old rules. Every hallway, every chamber, every gilded corner whispered the same command. Order above all else. For those who live within its walls, protocol was not a suggestion. It was a lifeline, a shield, a silent authority that demanded obedience without question. Princess had grown up surrounded by this invisible architecture of expectation. From her earliest memories, she had understood the weight of every glance, the meaning behind every bow, every nod, every measured word. Even laughter had boundaries. Freedom, in the truest sense, was a luxury the palace rarely permitted. The guards were the living embodiments of this order. trained to anticipate threats, to act decisively, yet to move within the confines of centuries of codified rules. One misstep, one deviation, could unravel the delicate balance that kept the royal household intact. Every day, drills were conducted. Every movement was catalogued. Visitors were scrutinized. Packages were inspected. And even the most trusted aides knew that loyalty was measured by adherence to rules as much as by intent. The palace was a chessboard, and each player moved according to scripts written long before they were born. Yet, rules have a way of colliding with reality. The palace, with all its grandeur, all its meticulously documented procedures, was still a human space. Mistakes happened. Surprises occurred. Threats emerged that no manual could foresee. It was in this tension between rigid protocol and the unpredictable nature of life that the story of Princess Anne and her protector began to take shape. The guard who had shielded her in silence knew this truth intimately. Rules were meant to guide, not to blind. Yet, to break them was almost unthinkable. He had been trained for years to anticipate every eventuality, to act only within the strict limits of his duty. Yet instinct had demanded a choice. A split-second decision, one that defied the weight of centuries, had saved him from a moment she might never fully understand. And now, the enormity of that choice began to settle like a quiet storm within him. Inside the palace, there were watchers beyond the guards. Advisors, aides, and senior officials monitored actions, aware that deviation could lead to scandal. The smallest breach of protocol could become a headline, a story dissected for generations. For a guard, the rules were absolute. Loyalty was measured not just by courage, but by compliance. And yet, courage sometimes demanded more than compliance. And, walking to grand halls, felt the invisible pull of these expectations. Every smile she offered, every gesture she made, had to pass the scrutiny of centuries. But the echo of the guard's silent act lingered in her mind. It was an anomaly in a world ruled by order. And anomalies, however small, have a way of revealing the human heart behind the gilded surface. The palace itself seemed alive with anticipation. Portraits of ancestors gazed down, eyes sharp, almost judging. Yet beneath the marble floors and behind the heavy doors, the quiet, unseen courage of a single individual had shifted the course of a day, leaving an indelible mark on history that will remain invisible to the world. Rules, and realize, were both protector and prison. They guided, yes, but they could not foresee every nuance of human instinct. And in moments where instinct had to supersede procedure, where courage had to override protocol, only the truest acts of loyalty endured. Somewhere nearby, the guard resumed his watch, his posture perfect, his gaze unwavering. But a subtle tension lingered, a silent acknowledgement that he had done what the rules forbade, and yet, in doing so, had fulfilled their ultimate purpose, the protection of the princess. In this world, where every action was observed, documented, and judged, the intersection of human intuition and rigid protocol would become the defining test of loyalty. And as Princess moved forward, unaware of the full extent of what had just occurred, the palace itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next challenge that would test the boundaries of courage, duty, and the invisible threads that bind them together. The palace seemed ordinary that morning. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows, casting patterns on the polished marble floors. Courtiers moved with practiced elegance, attending to duties scripted and rehearsed for generations. Yet beneath the calm exterior, the air was taut with anticipation, an invisible tension that Anne could not explain. She walked the grand hall, her steps echoing like a heartbeat, each one measured, deliberate. Her mind was occupied with routine matters, schedules, audiences, ceremonies. But the palace had a rhythm of its own, one that could shift in an instant. It happened without warning. A sound, a subtle misstep, a faint shuffle in a distant corridor caught the attention of the guards. For any ordinary observer, it would have gone unnoticed. But for those trained to see the cracks in the flow of order, it was a signal, sharp and unmistakable. And paused, instinct stirring at the edge of her awareness. She turned slightly, sensing a presence that should not have been there. The world of gilded corridors and ceremonial composure had cracked, revealing the fragility beneath. The guard, the one who had been quietly observing, tensed. Years of training and instinct collided in an instant. His eyes scanned the hall, noting the positions of other guards, the angles of the corridors, the potential paths of the threat. Every movement mattered. Every second counted. Then he saw it, a figure, subtle and unassuming, moving in a direction that should have been impossible. No one else noticed. Courtiers continued their measured routines. Servants carried trays, and advisors whispered behind closed doors. But the guard's focus narrowed to a single point, the path that led directly toward Princess Anne. Time seemed to slow, and, unaware of precise danger, continued walking, her head held high, her composure unbroken. The palace itself seemed to hold its breath. The guard's mind raced through possibilities, contingency after contingency. Protocol screamed in his ears, do not intervene, follow procedure, maintain order. But instinct was louder. Instinct demanded action. He moved, swiftly, silently, positioning himself between Anne and the unseen threat. His body became a shield, his presence a barrier. No words, no alerts, just a single, decisive act that changed the course of what could have been a disaster. And felt a subtle shift, a near imperceptible nudge, a pressure that redirected her path without her realizing. She glanced at the guard, her eyes meeting his for a brief, almost electric moment. Something had been averted. She did not yet know what, but the weight of relief washed over her like a sudden tide. The threat passed as quietly as it had arrived. The figure disappeared into the shadows, unnoticed by anyone else. Courtiers continued their routines, oblivious of the moment that had just unfolded. The palace, with all its centuries of tradition, seemed unchanged. Yet for Anne and the guard, everything had shifted. Her hands trembled slightly, though she would not show it. Her mind raced, trying to comprehend what had just occurred. And then, the guard leaned in, not in command, not in alarm, but in a whisper, the words carrying a gravity that would stay with her forever. "You are safe," he said, barely audible. "No one will know, and you will not be harmed. Trust me." Anne's eyes widened. The simplicity of the words belied their profound significance. In that whisper, she felt an overwhelming sense of protection, loyalty, and courage. Tears threatened, but she held them back. Her composure, trained and polished, clashed with the raw humanity of the moment. The palace resumed its rhythm, the ordinary facades restored. But Anne knew something irreversible had happened. Protocol had been broken, rules had been bent, and yet in that act of quiet defiance, true loyalty had been revealed. The guard returned to his position, calm once more, eyes scanning, posture perfect. No one could see the internal conflict, the choice he had made, the courage it had required. The palace demanded perfection, but it did not always account for the human heart behind the uniform. And as Anne continued her day, the whisper lingered in her mind, a quiet promise, a silent shield, a moment of courage that had transcended protocol. She did not yet fully understand the depth of the act, but she knew it had changed her. For in a world governed by rules where every action was scrutinized and every deviation punished, the unexpected could arrive at any moment. And it was in those moments that the true measure of loyalty and bravery was revealed. The corridor was silent, save for the faint echo of Anne's steps fading into the distance. But inside the guard, a storm raged, a clash of duty and instinct that no rulebook could resolve. For decades, he had lived by protocol, trained to protect, to observe, to never deviate. And yet, in a single heartbeat, he had done exactly that. He recalled the moment in vivid detail. The figure approaching, the subtle shift in Anne's path, the instant where hesitation could have meant disaster. Every guard had been trained to act within the confines of procedure, to summon reinforcements, to signal, to wait. But the seconds had been too precious, the threat too immediate. His hands had moved before his mind could catch up. A shield raised, a step positioned, a barrier of presence that altered the trajectory of fate itself. In that instant, protocol had become irrelevant. Duty had transformed into courage, obedience into intuition. And now, standing in the quiet aftermath, the weight of that choice pressed upon him. The palace had been designed to leave no room for improvisation. Every action recorded, every decision scrutinized. Yet here he stood, having acted without sanction, having broken rules that were older than most of the people he protected. He knew the consequences could be severe, Even if the incident remained unseen, even if no one spoke of it, the breach of protocol was undeniable. A guard who acted outside the bounds of instruction risked reprimand, loss of position, or worse. Yet none of that mattered compared to what had just been done. Princess and was safe. The moral calculus was stark. To follow protocol would have been to allow potential harm. To act, however, meant defying centuries of training, risking his career, his reputation, and possibly his place within the palace hierarchy. And yet, in the quiet clarity of that moment, he had known instinctively what needed to be done. He straightened his posture, hiding the tension in his shoulders, the rapid pulse of adrenaline that refused to settle. To anyone passing by, he was the same as always, disciplined, calm, vigilant. But inside, a quiet satisfaction mingled with fear. Satisfaction that he had protected the princess. Fear that the world, rigid and unyielding, might not understand why. The choice, once made, became a quiet testament to the human element within the palace's rigid framework. Rules guided actions, yes, but they could not replace judgment, compassion, or instinct. And in this intersection of protocol and humanity, the true essence of loyalty revealed itself. Not in obedience, but in courage. As Anne's figure disappeared from sight, the guard's eyes followed, not with anxiety, but with quiet pride. He had acted when the world demanded an action, had spoken when silence would have been expected. And though no one might ever know the truth, the impact of that choice would resonate beyond the walls of the palace, within the hearts of those it touched most profoundly. He whispered again, barely audible even to himself, "You are safe. That is enough." In a world dictated by rules, where every movement was measured and every action weighed against centuries of tradition, the courage to act was rare. Yet rare or not, it had happened. And it would not be forgotten, not by the guard, not by the invisible ledger of history that records not only what was done, but why. The palace continued its rhythm, the drills, the ceremonies, the elegant facade of order. But within its walls, a silent act of defiance had reshaped the day, had rewritten a moment in time with quiet precision. And somewhere in the marble corridors and golden chambers, the story of that decision lingered, unseen, unheard, yet profoundly felt. The palace corridors had returned to their usual rhythm, footsteps echoing softly, tapestries swaying gently with a subtle movement of air, golden chandeliers gleaming, as if nothing had occurred. Yet for Princess N, nothing felt ordinary. She paused near a quiet alcove, the weight of an unspoken moment pressing against her chest. The world continued around her. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors. Servants carried trays of tea. Guards remained vigilant. But felt a tremor within her, a recognition of something profound that had just passed. She turned slightly, and there he was, the guard who had acted without hesitation, without seeking permission, without concern for the centuries of rules he had defied. He stood as he always did, disciplined, composed, and vigilant. Yet there was something different now, something almost imperceptible in the lines of his posture, the subtle shift of his gaze. He stepped closer, careful, deliberate, yet with a gentleness that betrayed the gravity of the moment. No one else could have known what had occurred. No one else could have understood the choice, the courage, the quiet defiance it had required. But, and felt it. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "You are safe. More than safe. You are unharmed and scathed and free from the shadow that approached. Trust me, it will not touch you." The simplicity of the words belied their weight. Each syllable carried a depth of devotion, a clarity of courage, and a selflessness that Anne had rarely experienced outside the rarest moments of human intimacy. It was a whisper, yes, but one that resonated louder than any proclamation, louder than the grandeur of the palace itself. Tears welled in Anne's eyes, not of fear, but of overwhelming gratitude, awe, and a sudden, intimate understanding of loyalty. Here was a man who had placed duty aside for instinct, who had broken protocol for humanity, who had chosen courage over caution, who had risked everything to shield her from harm. Her hands trembled slightly. She could not speak immediately. Words seemed small, inadequate in the face of such a profound act. The whisper had done more than convey safety. It had conveyed truth, a truth about bravery that could not be taught, about loyalty that could not be measured, about love and humanity that existed quietly in unexpected places. "Why?" she finally managed, her voice trembling. "Why did you—" He shook his head, almost imperceptibly, a gesture that spoke volumes without violating the silence. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said. "Because sometimes rules must bend for what is greater than them. Because no protocol can measure the value of a life you are sworn to protect." The weight of his words sank deep and felt it in her bones, in her heart, in the very rhythm of her breath. The guard had acted when the world expected inaction, had spoken when silence was demanded, had risked everything for her, yet sought nothing in return. A tear finally slipped down her cheek, not a tear of weakness, but of realization, of gratitude, of witnessing true courage. And she knew in that moment that nothing in her life, no ceremony, no accolade, no royal title, could ever replace the value of that act, the intimacy of that choice, the profound human connection that had been silently forged between them. The palace continued around them, oblivious to the depth of the moment. Courtiers, aides, and advisors went about their duties, blind to the drama that had unfolded in the quiet corners. But Anne and the guard shared a secret that no wall, no rule, no observer could ever diminish. A secret of courage, of loyalty, of the quiet heroism that exists beyond history's gaze. She straightened her posture, composing herself, but the tears remained, a reminder of a moment that would linger forever. And somewhere in the palace, the guard returned to his watch, disciplined, calm, but carrying the silent acknowledgement that he had changed history, not with force, but with instinct and heart. And for Princess Anne, that whisper would echo for a lifetime, a memory of bravery and humanity that would remain unbroken, unshaken, and unforgettable. The palace had returned to its usual rhythm, yet nothing felt the same to Princess Anne. The grand halls, the polished marble, the silent portraits, they were all witnesses to a moment no one else would ever know. A moment that passed unseen, but whose echoes lingered in the very core of her being. She walked slowly through the corridors, her footsteps soft against the marble, her mind replaying the incident over and over. The whisper of the guard, the quiet defiance of protocol, the courage that had saved her. It all came rushing back in waves of gratitude and awe. Tears still lingered at the corners of her eyes, a silent testimony to the weight of what had happened. The world outside the palace remained unaware, blind to bravery that had unfolded in silence. Courtiers continued their rehearsed routines, advisors murmured over papers, and guards maintained their stoic vigilance, all unaware of the invisible thread of protection that had woven itself through the day. And paused before a portrait of one of her ancestors, a figure whose gaze seemed stern, demanding, almost imperious. She felt the contrast sharply. Centuries of protocol and expectation, and yet here, in a single unscripted moment, human courage had rewritten the rules, even if only briefly. The realization struck her deeply. Loyalty, bravery, and humanity could not be captured by tradition or ceremony. They existed in moments, fleeting yet eternal, in the choices of individuals who dare to act. The guard remained nearby, vigilant yet calm, his posture as disciplined as ever. No one would ever know the full depth of what had occurred, but and understood, in the quiet, intimate acknowledgement of his actions. She found a bond that needed no words, no public recognition, no ceremonial validation. It was private, sacred, and profoundly transformative. As the day wore on, and reflected not only on her own vulnerability, but on the quiet strength of those who serve, who protect, who act when the world demands an action. The palace, for all its grandeur, was a place of rules and ritual, but also of humanity, hidden in the hearts of the loyal. She realized that courage often comes in small, almost invisible gestures, and that true loyalty sometimes requires breaking the very rules it is meant to uphold. In the following days, life in the palace resumed its outward normalcy, yet and carried the memory of that moment like a secret flame, a reminder that the world behind the gilded walls was not just about protocol, but about human instinct, empathy, and courage. She thought often of the guard, of the silent act that had changed everything, and she understood that some stories, though invisible to the public eye, shape our lives more profoundly than any headline ever could. And somewhere in the quiet corridors, the guard continued his watch, bound by duty but guided by instinct, aware that he had done what no manual could teach, what no protocol could dictate. His act would remain unrecorded, unseen by history, but its impact on the princess, on the palace, on the understanding of what true courage meant, would resonate forever. In reflection, and knew this, true loyalty, genuine bravery, and profound humanity often exist in the silent spaces between action and consequence. And it is in those spaces that the heart reveals its deepest truths. The palace stood as it always had, grand, imposing, and silent, in its centuries of tradition. To the casual observer, nothing had changed. The halls gleamed, the chandeliers sparkled, and the rhythm of courtly life continued without pause. Yet within its walls, an invisible thread lingered, carrying the weight of a single, extraordinary act. Princess walked those same corridors, but she carried a new awareness, a quiet reverence for the unseen forces that protect and sustain. The guard who had broken protocol, who had acted without hesitation, who had risked everything without seeking recognition, had left an indelible mark. His courage, silent and uncelebrated, had transformed a moment, a day, and in some ways, the very understanding of loyalty itself. She remembered the whisper, the word so simple, yet so profound. "You are safe." Those words, spoken in the hushed intimacy of corridor, had echoed through her mind, through her heart, and through the unspoken fabric of the palace itself. It was a reminder that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. In the days and months that followed, and carried a memory with her, a private testament to bravery and humanity. The world outside would never know, and the palace would never record the act in its ledgers or chronicles. But the legacy of the guard was alive, in her gratitude, in her understanding, in the quiet recognition that human instinct can surpass centuries of rules. She saw him on duty, ever vigilant, ever composed, yet now with a subtle aura of quiet pride, a knowledge that it acted rightly even when it defied the strictest expectations. Others may have observed only a disciplined figure in uniform, but saw everything. The courage, the selflessness, the unrecorded heroism that had saved her in an instant. And she realized that history often overlooks the quiet moments, the small gestures that carry enormous weight. The chronicles may celebrate battles won, decrees signed, ceremonies completed, but true heroism often resides in the shadows, in moments invisible to the public eye, yet monumental to those who experience them. The guard's legacy was not written in gold, not carved into marble, not spoken in speeches. It was alive in trust and protection, in a connection forged by instinct and heart. It was a legacy that could never be replicated by ceremony or protocol, for it existed in the very human choices that define courage. And paused, looking at the palace in its full, imposing glory. To many, it was a symbol of power and tradition. To her, it was also a reminder that the greatest acts of bravery often happen quietly, unseen, and yet they echo forever in the hearts of those who bear witness, even silently. And somewhere, in the corridors lined with portraits and history, the guard continued his watch, steadfast and loyal. His actions, unrecorded by history, uncelebrated by the world, had left a legacy greater than any title or accolade. The preservation of life, the protection of trust, and the demonstration that courage sometimes lives in whispers, not in proclamations. Princess smiled faintly, a tear glinting in her eye. She had witnessed a truth that few would ever see, a truth about bravery, humanity, and the bonds that exist beyond protocol. And she knew with absolute certainty that the legacy of that silent protector will remain with her forever, a story unspoken, yet eternally alive in the heart.